The judge's voice, a gravelly sneer that echoed slightly in the sterile courtroom, cut through the air. "Mr. Carter, is this some kind of joke?" Judge Wallace leaned forward, his black robes bunching at his shoulders, and glared down from the bench. "You're wasting this court's time with blurry photos and a sob story." Beside her, Imani felt her father, David, shrink. His work-worn hands, usually so steady, trembled as they rested on the polished table. He had done everything right, yet here, in the Clayton courthouse, he was being treated like a fool. And the judge's mocking gaze was now turning to her. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B in the St. Louis County Courthouse hummed a relentless, indifferent tune. It was a sound Imani Carter knew she'd never forget. The soundtrack to her father's humiliation. From his elevated perch, Judge Arthur Wallace peered down at them, his face a mask of theatrical impatience. His white hair was perfectly coiffed, a stark contrast to the disdain that curled his lip. He held up their evidence, a stack of photographs David Carter had meticulously taken, and let them drop onto his desk with a dismissive thud. "Honestly," Judge Wallace sighed, addressing the mostly empty gallery as if performing a monologue, "the citizens of Clayton deserve better than this. Mr. Carter, you bring a claim for $3,000 against a reputable local business, and this is your proof." He gestured vaguely at the scattered photos. Grainy pictures of... what am I even looking at? A smudge? A shadow? A nervous titter rippled through the few people in the pews. A bailiff, another litigant waiting their turn, a woman who looked like a bored court reporter. To Imani, it sounded like a chorus of hyenas. Her father, David Carter, a man whose quiet dignity was his armor, simply stared at the defense table. His shoulders, broad from 40 years of hauling equipment for the city's parks department, were slumped in defeat. "Your Honor," David began, his voice raspy, "if you'd let me explain, the mechanic at Precision Auto, I've read your complaint, Mr. Carter," the judge interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "You claim they replaced your transmission, and it failed a week later. They claim you must have damaged it yourself. It's your word against the word of Mr. Franklin, a man who has run a successful business in this community for 20 years. He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning. "Who do you think the court is going to find more credible?" The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't a real question. It was a declaration, a verdict already rendered. Imani felt a hot surge of anger lick at her insides. She was 17, a senior at Clayton High, but she felt like a child again, helpless as she watched her father be stripped of his dignity. This wasn't just about the money. $3,000 was a staggering sum for them. It was emergency savings, the buffer against disaster that her father had painstakingly built over years of overtime shifts and skipped lunches. It was the money he was going to use to help with her college textbooks in the fall. But this was about respect. The casual, systemic way a man like Judge Wallace could look at a man like her father and see nothing of value. She glanced at Mr. Franklin, the owner of Precision Auto. He was sitting at the plaintiff's table, a portly man in a crisp polo shirt, looking entirely unconcerned. He smirked, a subtle, confident expression that made Imani's blood boil. He knew the game. He knew the judge. They probably played golf together at the same manicured country club. "But I have the report from the second mechanic," David insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "He said the torque converter was installed improperly. It's right there in the file, Your Honor. Page 3. Judge Wallace made a show of flipping through the thin folder, his eyes barely scanning the page. "Ah, yes. A report from your cousin's friend, I presume. Someone from a back alley garage in the city?" David flinched, as if struck. "No, sir. He's a certified mechanic at a dealership in Manchester." "How convenient," the judge droned, his sarcasm a blunt instrument. "Mr. Franklin, do you have anything to add to this riveting drama?" Mr. Franklin stood, his bearing smooth and practiced. "Only that we stand by our work, Your Honor. We've served this community for 2 decades. Our reputation speaks for itself. We can't be held responsible for what customers do once they drive off the lot. For all we know, Mr. Carter was hauling heavy loads, putting undue stress on the vehicle. The transmission was sound when it left our shop. It was a lie, a bald-faced, venomous lie. Her father's 2012 Ford Escape was his baby. He used it to drive to work and to the grocery store. The heaviest thing it ever hauled was Imani's cello for orchestra practice. "That's not true!" Imani heard the words escape her lips before she could stop them. They were louder than she intended, sharp and clear in the quiet room. Every head swiveled towards her. The bailiff stiffened. Her father's eyes widened in alarm. But it was Judge Wallace's gaze that held her captive. His eyebrows shot up, a flicker of genuine surprise momentarily replacing his bored arrogance. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low octave. He leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing. "And who might you be?" Imani's heart hammered against her ribs, but she straightened her spine. She had spent the last 3 years of her life on the Clayton High debate team, arguing in front of crowds, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of this judge's stare. "I'm Imani Carter, sir. He's my father." Judge Wallace's lips twisted into a condescending smile. "I see. And are you his legal counsel, Miss Carter? Did you recently pass the Missouri bar in between high school classes?" The smirk from Mr. Franklin widened. The bailiff coughed to cover a laugh. The heat in Imani's cheeks was scorching. She felt her father's hand on her arm, a gentle, warning squeeze. "Sit down, honey. Don't make it worse." But she couldn't. She had watched her father work until his body ached, watched him count every dollar, watched him sacrifice every personal want so she could have a better future. He had taught her to be strong, to be smart, to stand up for what was right. And she would not sit here in silence and watch this man, this system, break him. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I'm just a citizen who believes the court is supposed to be impartial." The judge's smile vanished. The air in the room grew cold, the hum of the lights suddenly deafening. "You are on the verge of being held in contempt, young lady," Judge Wallace said, his voice like chipping ice. "This is a court of law, not a school play. Your father is failing to make his case. These proceedings are over. I am finding in favor of the defendant. Case dismissed." He banged the gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. Final, absolute. It echoed in the silence, a pronouncement of their failure, their invisibility. David Carter's head bowed completely, a silent admission of defeat. Mr. Franklin packed his briefcase, a triumphant gleam in his eye. The judge was already shuffling papers, moving on, erasing them from his world. But for Imani, it wasn't over. Something inside her, a core of steel forged in her father's love and her own relentless ambition, refused to break. The gavel's echo wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A challenge. And as Judge Wallace looked up, annoyed that they hadn't moved, he saw something in the teenage girl's eyes that made him pause. It wasn't fear or anger. It was focus. A cold, clear, calculating focus. He had just made the biggest mistake of his judicial career, and he was about to find out why. The walk out of the courthouse was a silent one, each step heavy with the weight of injustice. The grand stone building, meant to symbolize fairness and equality, felt like a tomb. David Carter didn't speak. He just walked, his gaze fixed on the concrete in front of him, as if the sheer force of his will was all that kept him from crumbling. Imani walked beside him, her own fury a tightly coiled spring in her chest. The judge's mocking words, "Did you recently pass the Missouri bar?" played on a loop in her mind. They reached their car, the very Ford Escape at the heart of the dispute, and the silence stretched, thick and painful. David finally broke it, his voice rough with unshed tears. I'm sorry, Imani. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have dragged you into that. Don't apologize, Dad, she said fiercely, turning to face him. The late autumn sun caught the silver streaks in his hair. He looked older than his 58 years. You did nothing wrong. That man, he didn't even look at the evidence. He decided the moment we walked in. It's the way of the world sometimes, he said, the old, tired phrase a shield against a pain too deep to name. No, Imani insisted, her voice hardening. It doesn't have to be. This wasn't just a moment of teenage defiance. It was the crystallization of a conviction that had been forming in her for years. It started in middle school, when she read To Kill a Mockingbird, and saw in Atticus Finch not a fictional hero, but the kind of person she wanted to be. It grew in high school, fueled by history classes that laid bare the long, brutal fight for civil rights. It solidified in the wood-paneled classroom of Mr. Davison, her debate coach, who taught her that a well-reasoned argument was a weapon, that words, structured correctly, could dismantle power. And it was cemented in the quiet moments with her father. David wasn't a man of many words, but his actions were volumes. Every night, after his shift, no matter how exhausted he would sit with her at their small kitchen table in their University City apartment while she did her homework. He'd read the newspaper, his brow furrowed in concentration, and ask her about her day. When she announced she wanted to be a lawyer, he didn't just smile. He went to the library and checked out books on Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley. He'd leave them on her pillow, silent offerings of support. When she won her first debate tournament, he framed the cheap plastic trophy and hung it in the living room as if it were an Olympic medal. And when she was accepted into the prestigious pre-law summer program at Washington University, a program that cost more than he made in a month, he never hesitated. He picked up extra shifts, sold his old fishing boat, and told her, with a fierce pride in his eyes, "You go and show them how brilliant you are, baby girl. Don't let anyone ever make you feel small." Judge Wallace had tried to make her father feel small, and in doing so, he had ignited a fire in Imani that would not be extinguished. That evening, their apartment felt different. The usual warmth was replaced by a somber quiet. David just sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. Imani retreated to her bedroom, the sanctuary where she had built her dreams. Her walls were covered not with posters of pop stars, but with quotes from Ruth Bader Ginsburg and flowcharts of legal arguments from past debate competitions. On her desk, beneath a stack of textbooks, was her prized possession. A thick, leather-bound copy of the Constitution of the United States, a gift from her late grandfather. She pulled it out, its familiar weight a comfort in her hands. She ran her fingers over the embossed letters. This was supposed to mean something. We, the people, equal protection under the law. They weren't just words, they were a promise that had been broken today in courtroom 4B. She sat down at her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She didn't start with angry social media posts or desperate emails. She started with research. Cold, hard, methodical research. She began with Judge Arthur Wallace. The internet was a treasure trove. His biography on the St. Louis County Court website painted a picture of a pillar of the community. A graduate of St. Louis University School of Law, a former prosecutor, a man appointed to the bench 15 years ago. He was a member of the Missouri Bar Association, the Clayton Chamber of Commerce. He had pictures of himself shaking hands with senators and cutting ribbons at charity events. But Imani dug deeper. She left the polished surface of official websites and dove into case law databases, public records, and local news archives. She used the access codes she had been given for her WashU program, portals to a world of information hidden from the average citizen. Hours bled into one another. The city outside her window grew quiet. She found news articles about Judge Wallace's rulings. A pattern began to emerge. He had a statistically significant history of ruling in favor of local businesses in disputes against individuals, especially in small claims court, where people often represented themselves. She found a handful of appeals where his decisions had been overturned for procedural errors, but these were rare. Most people, like her father, didn't have the resources or the knowledge to appeal. They just accepted the loss and moved on. Then she found it. A small article in a local legal journal from 3 years ago. It detailed a complaint filed against Judge Wallace with the Missouri Commission on Retirement, Removal, and Discipline. The complaint alleged a pattern of judicial misconduct, including demonstrating a bias against pro se litigants and failing to maintain a demeanor of patience and dignity. The commission had ultimately dismissed the complaint, citing insufficient evidence, but the details were eerily familiar. The accuser described the same condescending tone, the same dismissive attitude, the same rush to judgment. It wasn't just them. It wasn't just her father. It was a pattern. A new search term popped into her head. She typed, "Court watching programs, St. Louis." The results were immediate. Several local civil rights organizations and the Washington University School of Law itself had programs where students and volunteers would sit in on court proceedings to observe and document the behavior of judges, looking for exactly this kind of systemic bias. An idea sparked in her mind. A daring, audacious plan. It was more than just getting her father's money back. It was about holding Judge Wallace accountable. It was about making the promise of the Constitution real, right here in Clayton, Missouri. She looked at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began to write. She wasn't just taking notes anymore. She was drafting a legal motion. A motion to vacate judgment and reopen case. She laid out her arguments, her fingers flying across the page. She cited Missouri Supreme Court Rule 74-6B, which allows a judgment to be set aside for reasons of fraud, misrepresentation, or other misconduct of an adverse party. She argued that Mr. Franklin had misrepresented the quality of his work. Then, more boldly, she began to draft a second section, citing violations of the Missouri Code of Judicial Conduct. She quoted Canon 2, Rule 2.8b. "A judge shall be patient, dignified, and courteous to litigants, jurors, witnesses, lawyers, and others with whom the judge deals in an official capacity." She described, in precise, unemotional language, every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture, every instance where Judge Wallace had failed to give her father's evidence due consideration. She was no longer just a daughter fighting for her dad. She was an advocate building a case, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was just the beginning. The gavel's echo was still ringing in her ears, but now she was preparing an echo of her own. The next morning, Imani woke with a sense of purpose that felt like a shield. The exhaustion from her late-night research was a dull ache behind her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a sharp, clear resolve. She found her father in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, the classified section of the newspaper spread open before him. He was looking for side jobs. The sight sent a pang of grief and fury through her. "Dad, we're not giving up," she said, her voice firm. He looked up, his eyes weary. "Imani, what can we do? The judge made his decision. It's over." "No, it's not." She slid the legal pad onto the table. The pages were filled with her neat, determined script. "It's called a motion to vacate judgment. We can argue that the judge showed bias and that Mr. Franklin lied about his work. We can ask for a new hearing." David picked up the papers, his brow furrowed as he tried to decipher the legal jargon. He saw the case numbers, the references to court rules, the formal language. He saw the hours of work his daughter had poured into this. A flicker of hope warred with a lifetime of pragmatism. This is incredible, honey. But who's going to file this? We can't afford a lawyer, and that judge, he'll just laugh us out of the courtroom again." "He might," Imani admitted, "but this time we won't be alone." That afternoon, after school, Imani took the bus to Washington University. The campus, with its Gothic architecture and manicured lawns, felt like a different world from the cold reality of the Clayton courthouse. It represented the future she was fighting for. She wasn't a student here yet, not officially, but her summer program had given her a network, and she was about to use it. She found Dr. Lena Petrova in her office at the School of Law. Dr. Petrova was a formidable woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She taught constitutional law and ran the university's court-watching program. She had been Imani's favorite instructor during the summer, a woman who had challenged her, pushed her, and treated her like a future colleague rather than a high school kid. Imani stood in the doorway of the book-lined office, her heart pounding. She recounted the story of what had happened in Judge Wallace's courtroom, her voice clear and steady as she laid out the facts, just as she'd been taught in debate. She didn't embellish or get emotional. She presented the sequence of events, the judge's comments, his refusal to consider their evidence. Dr. Petrova listened intently, her fingers steepled under her chin. She didn't interrupt. When Imani was finished, the professor was silent for a long moment. "Judge Wallace," she said, her voice a low hum. "He's been on our radar for a while. We've had anecdotal reports. Nothing we could build a formal complaint on. Pro-se litigants are often too intimidated to speak up, and without a transcript, it's just their word against his." "I have my notes," Imani said, pushing her legal pad across the desk. "And I wrote down everything I could remember, word for word." Dr. Petrova scanned the pages, her eyes widening slightly as she read Imani's meticulously drafted motion. She looked up at Imani, a new level of respect in her gaze. "You drafted this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." "You cited Rule 74-06 and the Code of Judicial Conduct. This is excellent work, Imani, better than some of my first-year law students." Imani felt a blush of pride, but she pressed on. "It's not enough, though. My dad is right. The judge will just dismiss it. He'll dismiss me. We need more." "What do you have in mind?" Dr. Petrova asked, leaning forward, fully engaged now. "Your court-watching program," Imani said, the words tumbling out. "When we file the motion, there will be a new hearing date. I want your students there. I want members of the Bar Association there. I want him to know he's being watched. He acts that way because he thinks no one with any power is paying attention. We need to change that." A slow smile spread across Dr. Petrova's face. "That is a brilliant strategy. It's one thing to dismiss a man he perceives as powerless. It's another thing entirely to do it in front of a dozen aspiring lawyers and a representative from the Missouri Bar." The plan came together quickly. Dr. Petrova agreed to help Imani file the motion pro se, meaning she and her father would continue to represent themselves, but with the law clinic's guidance. This was crucial. It kept Imani at the center of the fight. Dr. Petrova then made a few calls. The first was to a friend at the local chapter of the ACLU. The second was to a former student who now worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The third was to the head of the Bar Association's Ethics Committee. She didn't ask for intervention, merely for observation. She framed it as a perfect real-world learning opportunity for her students. A week later, a new hearing was set. The motion to vacate had been accepted, a procedural step that Judge Wallace likely saw as a minor annoyance, a piece of paperwork to be swatted away. He would be expecting the black man and his loud-mouthed daughter to show up again, to be summarily dismissed once and for all. The morning of the hearing, Imani dressed carefully. She chose a simple, dark blue dress, the most professional-looking thing she owned. She stood before the mirror, not as a high school senior, but as an advocate. She practiced her opening statement, her voice quiet but firm in the small apartment. Her father watched her, a mixture of awe and terror in his eyes. "Are you sure about this, Imani?" I don't want you to get in trouble." "The only one who should be in trouble is him, Dad," she said, turning to him. She adjusted his tie. "You taught me to stand up for myself. I'm just doing what you taught me." When they arrived at the courthouse, things were different. They weren't alone. In the hallway outside courtroom 4B, a group of 10 law students, all dressed in professional attire and carrying notebooks, were waiting. Dr. Petrova was with them, and beside her stood a stern-looking man in a tailored suit whom she introduced as Mr. Abernathy, a representative from the Missouri Bar Association's Oversight Committee. A young woman with a press pass hanging from her neck gave them a nod. They all filed into the courtroom together. The space that had seemed so vast and empty before was now filled. The students took up the first 2 rows. Mr. Abernathy sat in the back, observing. The reporter sat near the aisle, pen poised. When Judge Wallace entered the courtroom, he stopped short. He clearly expected an empty room. He looked at the rows of well-dressed, attentive young people, his gaze lingering on Dr. Petrova and then on the man in the back. A flicker of confusion, then annoyance, crossed his face. He took his seat, his movements stiff. He cleared his throat and called the case. "In the matter of Carter versus Precision Auto, we are here to hear the plaintiff's unusual motion to vacate a prior judgment." He looked down at David and Imani. His expression was a carefully controlled mask of judicial impartiality, but his eyes were cold as steel. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a tense, simmering anger. The audience had changed. The rules of the game had just been rewritten. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "since you were so eager to speak last time, perhaps you'd like to explain to the court why you believe this matter deserves a second of our time." He thought he was calling her bluff. He thought he could intimidate her, make her crumble in front of her ad hoc audience. He still saw a teenage girl. He had no idea he was facing a warrior. Imani rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and calm. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The 10 law students from Washington University leaned forward, their pens hovering over their notepads. Dr. Petrova watched with a neutral, academic curiosity that betrayed nothing of her investment. In the back, Mr. Abernathy from the Bar Association folded his hands, his gaze fixed on the 17-year-old girl standing before the bench. Imani placed her hands lightly on the edge of the table. She didn't look at her notes. She looked directly at Judge Wallace, meeting his icy stare without flinching. "Good morning, Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, resonating with a maturity that seemed to startle him. "My name is Imani Carter. I am here with my father, David Carter, to argue our motion to vacate judgment in the case of Carter versus Precision Auto, case number 25 SC 1108. She paused, letting the formal language settle in the room. This wasn't the outburst of an emotional teenager anymore. This was a structured, legal argument. "We have filed this motion based on 2 primary grounds, as permitted under Missouri Supreme Court Rule 74.06. The first is the misrepresentation of facts by the defendant, Mr. Franklin. The second, and more significant, is the evidence of judicial bias, which prevented a fair and impartial hearing in violation of the Missouri Code of Judicial Conduct." A low murmur rippled through the rows of law students. Judge Wallace's jaw tightened. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his bench. "Those are very serious allegations, Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You'd better have more than teenage dramatics to back them up." "I do, Your Honor," Imani replied, her tone unwavering. "Let's begin with the defendant's misrepresentation. Mr. Franklin stated in his testimony that his shop's work was sound and that any subsequent damage to the transmission must have been caused by my father through misuse, such as, and I quote from my notes, hauling heavy loads. We were not given an opportunity to rebut this claim, which is baseless." She gestured toward her father. "My father's vehicle is a 2012 Ford Escape. According to the manufacturer's specifications, its maximum towing capacity is 1,500 pounds. My father has never installed a tow hitch. His daily commute is 8.4 miles. The vehicle is used for personal transportation, not commercial hauling. The defendant's claim was pure speculation, designed to mislead the court, and we were denied the chance to present evidence to the contrary. She then turned her attention to their own evidence. Furthermore, we submitted a signed and notarized report from a certified, independent mechanic, Mr. Andre Jones of Sunset Hills Automotive. His report, which the court dismissed as being from a back alley garage, definitively states that the transmission failure was due to an improperly seated torque converter, a clear error in installation. This was not a failure from wear and tear or misuse. It was a direct result of negligence on the part of Precision Auto. Judge Wallace started to interrupt, but Imani continued seamlessly, her momentum building. Which brings me to my second point, Your Honor, the issue of judicial impartiality. Canon 1 of the Missouri Code of Judicial Conduct states that a judge shall uphold and promote the independence, integrity, and impartiality of the judiciary. Canon 2, Rule 2.2, requires a judge to perform all duties fairly and impartially. She took a step forward, her voice resonating with a quiet power. Your Honor, from the moment we entered this courtroom, my father was not treated with the dignity and courtesy required by this code. His evidence was summarily dismissed without fair examination. His character was impugned. When he tried to speak, he was interrupted. When I tried to speak for him, I was mocked. She looked directly into Judge Wallace's eyes. You asked me, did you recently pass the Missouri bar in between high school classes? This question was not designed to seek information. It was designed to humiliate and intimidate a citizen in your courtroom. That is not the behavior of an impartial arbiter of justice. The judge's face had gone from pale to a deep, mottled red. He was visibly furious, but the presence of the observers held him in check. He couldn't simply shout her down or hold her in contempt, not without proving her entire point in front of a dozen witnesses and a bar representative. You are misinterpreting the law, young lady, he seethed, struggling to maintain a semblance of judicial composure. And you are mischaracterizing my actions. I simply found the defendant's testimony to be more credible. Credibility is supposed to be determined by an examination of facts and evidence, not by a litigant's social standing or the number of years they've been in business. Imani shot back, her voice ringing with conviction. You made your determination of credibility before we had even finished presenting our case. You stated, and again, I am quoting from my notes from the hearing on October 21st, it's your word against the word of Mr. Franklin, a man who has run a successful business in this community for 20 years. Who do you think the court is going to find more credible? That, Your Honor, is not a question. It is a prejudgment. It is the very definition of bias. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Every law student was scribbling furiously. Mr. Abernathy's expression was unreadable, but he had not taken his eyes off Imani. David Carter stared at his daughter, his heart swelling with a pride so immense it threatened to break him. He saw not just his child, but a force of nature. Imani took a deep breath and delivered her closing. We are not asking for a favorable ruling, Your Honor. We are asking for a fair one. We are asking for the judgment to be vacated and for a new hearing to be granted, one where the evidence can be presented fully and judged on its merits, free from prejudice. We are asking for the promise of equal justice under the law to be fulfilled in this courtroom. Thank you. She sat down. The sound of her dress rustling was the only noise in the room. Judge Wallace was trapped. His face was a thunderous mask of rage. He looked from Imani to the rows of silent observers, to the impassive face of the bar representative. Every exit was blocked. To deny the motion now would be a blatant admission of everything Imani had just accused him of. To grant it would be a humiliating defeat, a concession that a teenage girl had successfully challenged his authority and his conduct. He gripped his gavel, his knuckles bone white. For a long, tense moment, it seemed he might bring it down and end the proceedings with sheer, explosive anger. But then, he looked at Mr. Abernathy again, and some of the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by the cold calculation of self-preservation. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "The court," he began, his voice strained, "finds that, in the interest of ensuring all parties feel they have been adequately heard, the motion to vacate judgment is granted." A collective silent gasp went through the courtroom. "A new hearing will be scheduled," he said, his words clipped, "with a different judge presiding." He couldn't bring himself to look at Imani or her father. "This court is adjourned." He slammed the gavel down, a sharp, angry crack that lacked any of its previous authority. It was the sound not of power, but of defeat. He rose and swept out of the courtroom through a side door, his black robes billowing behind him like a cape of shame. The moment the door closed, the courtroom erupted in quiet chaos. The law students broke into hushed, excited chatter. Dr. Petrova walked over to the Carters' table, a brilliant, proud smile on her face. "Imani," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "That was one of the finest oral arguments I have ever witnessed, in any courtroom." David Carter wrapped his daughter in a hug, burying his face in her shoulder. He couldn't speak. He just held her, the tremors of relief and pride shaking his entire body. Over his shoulder, Imani saw the reporter from the Post-Dispatch hurrying out of the room, her phone already to her ear. The story was no longer about a disputed $3,000 repair bill. It was about to become something much, much bigger. The story broke the next morning. It wasn't tucked away in the Metro section. It was on the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch website, right below the banner headline. The title was simple, direct, and devastating. Teenager accuses county judge of bias, wins new hearing in courtroom showdown. The article, written by the reporter who had been in the courtroom, laid out the entire saga. It recounted the initial hearing, quoting Judge Wallace's condescending remarks to Imani and her father. It detailed Imani's meticulously crafted motion and her powerful verbatim rebuttal. It highlighted the presence of the Washington University law students and the representative from the Missouri Bar Association. By the time David Carter left for work, his phone was buzzing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. The aftershock hit Judge Wallace with the force of a wrecking ball. The Post-Dispatch story was just the beginning. By noon, the local news channels had picked it up. They dispatched camera crews to the courthouse, hoping for a comment from the embattled judge who remained sequestered in his chambers. They ran Imani's high school yearbook photo alongside a stern, official portrait of Judge Wallace. The visual contrast was stark and compelling. The bright, ambitious young black woman versus the powerful, established, older white man. The court of public opinion was swift and merciless. Online comment sections exploded. People shared their own stories of feeling dismissed or mistreated in small claims court. The narrative Imani had crafted, of a systemic bias against ordinary people, resonated deeply. She had given a voice to a frustration that had been simmering in the community for years. For Imani, the sudden attention was overwhelming. Her principal called her into the office, not for discipline, but to shake her hand. Her debate coach, Mr. Davison, sent her a text that just said, "That's my champion. I've never been prouder." Her classmates, who had once seen her as just a quiet, studious girl, now looked at her with a new respect, a kind of awe. But the most significant calls came from Dr. Petrova. "The Commission on Retirement, Removal, and Discipline has officially opened a formal investigation into Judge Wallace's conduct, Imani," she said over the phone, her voice buzzing with energy. Your motion, combined with the press coverage and Mr. Abernathy's report, was the tipping point. They can't ignore it now. The investigation meant that Judge Wallace was temporarily reassigned to administrative duties, stripped of his power to preside over cases. The symbol of his authority, the gavel he had wielded with such arrogance, was effectively taken from him. A few days later, another call came. It was from a lawyer, a partner at one of the most respected civil rights firms in St. Louis. He offered to represent the Carters pro bono in their new hearing against Precision Auto. "Frankly, Miss Carter," the lawyer said, "after what you did, there isn't a lawyer in this city who wouldn't be honored to stand with you." The new hearing was scheduled a month later, presided over by a different judge, a stern but scrupulously fair woman named Judge Diaz. The atmosphere could not have been more different. Mr. Franklin, the owner of Precision Auto, arrived looking pale and nervous. His smirk was gone, replaced by a deep-set frown. His lawyer, a high-priced attorney from a corporate firm, looked deeply unhappy to be there. The courtroom was once again filled with observers. This time, the Carters had a legal team. Their lawyer presented the evidence methodically. The report from the independent mechanic was entered into evidence and given significant weight. A digital forensics expert, hired by the law firm, had even analyzed the original blurry photos David had taken on his old phone and, by enhancing the resolution, was able to clearly show the misaligned parts in the transmission casing. When Mr. Franklin was cross-examined, he wilted under the precise, relentless questioning. He admitted that he hadn't personally inspected the vehicle. He conceded that he had no actual evidence that Mr. Carter had misused the car. He was forced to acknowledge that his testimony in the first hearing had been based on assumption, not fact. The verdict was swift. Judge Diaz awarded David Carter the full $3,000 for the faulty repair. Then she went a step further. Citing the bad faith and misleading testimony of the defendant in the initial hearing, she awarded an additional $2,000 in punitive damages. As they left the courtroom, victorious, David Carter was stopped by a group of people in the hallway. They were strangers, men and women of all ages and races. One by one, they came forward to thank him and his daughter. "The same thing happened to me last year with a landlord," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "I wish I'd had your daughter's courage." An elderly man shook David's hand. "You stood up to a bully," he said. "Thank you." It was then that Imani truly understood the scope of what she had done. It was never just about the money. It was about restoring her father's dignity. But in doing so, she had helped restore a measure of faith in the system for people who had lost it long ago. She had exposed a crack in the fortress of power and let the light in. The consequences for Arthur Wallace continued to mount. The Judicial Commission's investigation was thorough. They interviewed other litigants who, emboldened by Imani's story, came forward with their own accounts of his dismissive and biased behavior. Facing a public hearing and the near certainty of being formally removed from the bench, Judge Wallace quietly submitted his resignation, citing health reasons. His long career ended not with a laudatory retirement dinner, but in disgrace. The ripple effects spread through the St. Louis County court system. Spurred by the public outcry and the recommendations from the Bar Association, the presiding judge of the circuit court announced a new series of mandatory training programs for all judges, focusing on impartiality, procedural fairness for pro se litigants, and implicit bias. The Washington University Court Watching Program saw its funding tripled and its scope expanded. One evening, a few weeks later, Imani sat with her father at their kitchen table. A check from the court for $5,000 sat between them, but it seemed almost secondary. David was looking at a letter that had arrived that day. It was from the dean of the Washington University School of Law. He pushed it across the table to Imani. It was a formal offer of a full 4-year undergraduate scholarship, followed by guaranteed admission and a full scholarship to the law school. The letter read, in part, "In a world that is often cynical about the power of one individual to effect change, your integrity, intelligence, and profound courage have reminded us of the highest ideals of the legal profession. We would be honored to have you among us." Imani read the words, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she let the tears come. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a future she had secured not just for herself, but for the promise of justice she now knew was worth fighting for. The gavel's echo had faded, replaced by a new sound. The sound of a door to the future swinging wide open. Arthur Wallace sat in his study, the heavy damask curtains drawn against the afternoon light. The room, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. His resignation had been tendered, a carefully worded statement drafted by his lawyer that spoke of a desire to spend more time with his family. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. The truth was plastered across the internet, a digital stain that would never wash away. For weeks, he had been a ghost in his own life. His colleagues at the courthouse were polite but distant. The invitations to social events, the lifeblood of Clayton's legal and political circles, had stopped coming. The night the story broke, his wife, Eleanor, had looked at him across their pristine dining room table, the Post-Dispatch open between them, and asked a question that cut him to the bone. "Arthur, is this who you are?" He had tried to defend himself, of course. To her, to himself. He called the Carter girl arrogant, disrespectful. He claimed her father's case was frivolous, a waste of taxpayer money. He argued that a judge needed to be firm, to control the courtroom, to weed out the baseless claims that clogged the dockets. But his justifications sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The truth, the ugly, unvarnished truth, was that he hadn't seen David Carter as a credible man. He had seen a black man in worn clothes representing himself, and he had made an assumption. It was an unconscious reflex, a bias so deeply ingrained he wasn't even aware of it until it was thrown back in his face by a 17-year-old girl. He hadn't seen a diligent father, a hard-working citizen. He'd seen a stereotype, and he had treated him as such. The official investigation by the Commission on Retirement, Removal, and Discipline had been a quiet, methodical dismantling of his career. It wasn't a raucous trial, but a series of calm, professional interviews and document reviews. Mr. Abernathy's report from the second hearing was the cornerstone of their case. It was a dispassionate, factual account that damned him utterly. Abernathy noted Wallace's visible hostility and lack of judicial temperament, concluding that his behavior fell significantly short of the standards required by the Code of Judicial Conduct. Then came the other complaints. Emboldened by Imani's public victory, a half-dozen other people came forward. A single mother who felt belittled in a child support hearing. A small business owner who believed Wallace had unfairly sided with a politically connected developer. An immigrant who struggled with English and felt the judge had shown no patience or understanding. Each story, on its own, might have been dismissed. But together, they formed a pattern, a mosaic of casual cruelty and arrogance that was impossible to ignore. His lawyer had been blunt. "Art," he'd said, "you can fight this. We can drag it out for months. It will be public, it will be messy, and you will lose. Your pension might even be at risk. Or you can resign. Go quietly. Preserve what you can." So he had chosen the quiet path. But there was nothing quiet about the roar of condemnation in his own head. He remembered Imani Carter's face, her clear, steady eyes looking up at him from the plaintiff's table. She hadn't been shouting. She hadn't been hysterical. She had been precise, controlled, and armed with something more powerful than his gavel, the law itself. She had used his own rule book to defeat him. The irony was not lost on him. He, who had spent a lifetime in the law, had become complacent, lazy. He had forgotten that the robes and the elevated bench were not symbols of his own inherent superiority, but of a sacred trust given to him by the public. A trust, to be fair, a trust he had broken. His downfall had repercussions beyond his own home. At the Clayton courthouse, a palpable shift was underway. Judges were more patient, more deliberate, especially in the small claims and family court divisions where ordinary citizens most often encountered the justice system. The mandatory bias training, which might have once been treated as a bureaucratic chore, was now taken with a new seriousness. The story of Judge Wallace became a cautionary tale whispered in the hallways, a reminder that they were always being watched, not just by oversight committees, but by the public they served. For Mr. Franklin of Precision Auto, the consequences were more direct. The punitive damages awarded by Judge Diaz were a financial blow, but the damage to his reputation was far worse. The narrative of the case, that he had lied and taken advantage of a working-class man, only to be brought down by the man's brilliant daughter, was devastating for a business that relied on community trust. Online reviews for his shop plummeted. Customers canceled appointments. Within 6 months, the celebrating 20 years in business sign in his window was replaced by a "for lease" sign. His business, like Judge Wallace's career, had crumbled under the weight of a single profound act of injustice. One afternoon, months later, Arthur Wallace found himself driving through University City. On a whim, he took a detour and drove past the Carters' apartment building. It was a modest, clean brick building, like thousands of others in the county. He saw a light on in a second-floor window and imagined the scene inside. A father and a daughter, sitting at a kitchen table, planning a future that was now brighter than ever. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just anger or self-pity. It was a strange, hollow sense of envy. Imani Carter had fought for a principle. She had defended her family. She had stood for something. What, he wondered, had he stood for? In the end, he had stood only for his own pride, his own comfort, his own unexamined prejudices. And it had cost him everything. He drove away. No longer Judge Wallace, the powerful arbiter of law, but just Arthur Wallace, a disgraced man with nothing but time to contemplate the true meaning of justice. It was a lesson he had learned far too late, taught to him not in a lofty law school classroom, but by a teenage girl in a simple blue dress who refused to be made small. The scholarship letter from Washington University wasn't just an opportunity, it was a vindication. It was a tangible symbol that the world Imani believed in, a world where merit, intelligence, and integrity mattered more than status or prejudice, was not just a dream. As she walked the sprawling campus that fall, no longer as a summer visitor but as a full-fledged student, she felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. Her story had preceded her. In her political science classes and pre-law seminars, she was the Imani Carter. Some students approached her with awe, others with a touch of intimidation. But Imani didn't let the label define her. She had fought for the right to be in these rooms, and she wasn't going to waste a moment. She dove into her studies with the same intensity she had applied to her father's case, devouring textbooks, engaging in spirited debates with her professors, and spending long hours in the law library, a place that now felt like home. She became a star student in Dr. Petrova's undergraduate constitutional law class. The professor would often use the Carter case, now officially part of the university's legal ethics curriculum, as a case study. One day, while discussing judicial oversight, Dr. Petrova paused and looked directly at Imani. "Some people believe that the law is a fixed, immutable thing," she said to the lecture hall. "But the truth is, the law is a living document, and the justice system is a human institution. It is only as strong, as fair, and as impartial as the people who participate in it. Change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes It comes from a single citizen who refuses to accept injustice." The entire class turned to look at Imani, and a spontaneous applause broke out, a wave of respect and admiration that brought a flush to her cheeks. Her father, David, was also transformed. The weight of years of quiet struggle seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. With the $5,000 from the settlement, he paid off the new, properly installed transmission and put the rest into a savings account for Imani. But the real change was in his demeanor. He stood taller, spoke with a newfound confidence. The humiliation he had suffered in that courtroom had been exorcised, replaced by an unshakable pride in his daughter. He became a minor celebrity in his own right at the Parks Department. His co-workers, many of whom had faced their own battles with uncaring bureaucracies and dismissive authorities, saw him as a hero. "Your girl is something else, Dave," they'd say, clapping him on the back. He would just smile, a quiet, deep satisfaction in his eyes. "Yes, she is," he'd reply. "She always has been." Imani didn't rest on her laurels. She joined the university's chapter of the Innocence Project, working to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals. She volunteered for the court watching program that had been her salvation, now sitting in the back of courtrooms not as a litigant, but as an observer, a silent guardian ensuring that no other family would endure what hers had. One afternoon, while observing a routine traffic court, she saw a young woman, a Latina mother with a baby in her arms, struggling to communicate with a judge through a court-appointed translator. The judge was growing impatient, the translator was flustered, and the woman was on the verge of tears. The old, familiar anger flared in Imani. After the hearing, she approached the woman in the hallway. Using the Spanish she had diligently studied in high school, she helped the woman understand the fine she had been given and directed her to a legal aid clinic that could help her navigate the system. It was a small act, one that no newspaper would report on, but it felt just as important as her own celebrated case. It was the work that mattered. As she moved through her undergraduate years, her reputation grew. She won national moot court competitions, her name becoming known in legal education circles across the country. Law firms started sending recruitment letters before she had even taken the LSAT. She was a legal prodigy, but she remained grounded, her purpose clear. Her armor was no longer the defiant anger of a wronged daughter, but the cool, confident strength of a skilled advocate. She kept the faded legal pad on which she had drafted the motion to vacate. It sat on her desk, a constant reminder of where she had come from and why she was fighting. It reminded her that the law wasn't an abstract concept found only in dusty books. It was a tool. It could be a weapon used to oppress, as Judge Wallace had used it, or it could be a shield used to protect, as she had. On the day of her graduation from Washington University, with a degree in political science and a perfect GPA, her father sat in the audience, flanked by Dr. Petrova. As Imani's name was called, and she walked across the stage, the summa cum laude honors announced after her name. David Carter's eyes filled with tears. These were not the tears of humiliation he had almost shed in that courtroom years ago. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He saw his daughter, a woman of incredible strength and grace, a warrior who had taken their family's pain and forged it into a sword for the powerless. The announcer mentioned her full scholarship to the law school, and a special note was made of her contribution to judicial reform in the county. As she accepted her diploma, the crowd gave her a standing ovation. It wasn't just for her academic achievements, it was for her character. Later that day, standing under the shade of an old oak tree on campus, Dr. Petrova handed Imani a small, gift-wrapped box. Inside was a beautiful silver pen, engraved with a quote from Thurgood Marshall. "Where you see wrong or inequality or injustice, speak out, because this is your country." Imani looked from the pen to her father, to her mentor. The journey had been arduous, born of shame and anger. But it had led her here, to this moment of triumph, surrounded by love and respect. The battle against Judge Wallace was over, but Imani knew her fight was just beginning. And she was ready. 7 years after that fateful day in small claims court, the name Imani Carter was etched not just on the door of a corner office in a prestigious St. Louis law firm, but into the very fabric of the city's legal community. She had graduated at the top of her class from Washington University School of Law, served as editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and turned down lucrative offers from corporate firms in New York and Washington, D.C. to stay home. Her mission was in St. Louis. She had joined the civil rights firm that had represented her father, quickly rising through the ranks to become their youngest ever partner. She didn't take the easy cases. She sought out the Davids fighting the Goliaths, the tenants facing wrongful eviction by powerful slumlords, the employees fighting wage theft from multi-million-dollar corporations, the citizens whose civil liberties had been violated by those in power. She became known for her ferocious preparation, her calm demeanor in the courtroom, and her uncanny ability to dismantle an opponent's argument with surgical precision. Courtroom 4B, the site of her father's humiliation and her own transformation, had been renovated. The drab, beige walls were repainted, the worn-out furniture replaced. But for many in the courthouse, its legacy was indelible. It was known colloquially as Imani's courtroom. New judges assigned to that room were often told the story by clerks and bailiffs, a reminder of the standards they were expected to uphold and the consequences of failing to do so. David Carter was now retired, living comfortably in a small house he'd bought with his savings and the help of his daughter. He spent his days gardening and fishing, the quiet contentment of his life a stark contrast to the quiet desperation he had once felt. His greatest joy was watching Imani in court. He would sit in the back of the gallery, a proud, unassuming man in a simple suit, and watch his daughter command the room. He saw how other lawyers respected her, how judges listened intently to her arguments, how the people she represented looked at her with hope and gratitude. One crisp October afternoon, almost a decade to the day of the original hearing, Imani was arguing a major class action lawsuit against the county. The case alleged that the cash bail system disproportionately and unconstitutionally penalized the poor, keeping them incarcerated for minor offenses simply because they couldn't afford to pay. It was a complex, high-stakes case that she had been building for years. The opposing counsel was a team of seasoned, high-priced lawyers from the county counselor's office. The presiding judge was a woman known for her sharp legal mind and no-nonsense attitude. Judge Maria Diaz, the same judge who had awarded her father justice all those years ago. As Imani delivered her closing argument, her voice filled the packed courtroom. It was a masterful summation, weaving together constitutional principles, statistical data, and the powerful human stories of the people trapped by the system. She spoke of equal protection, of the presumption of innocence, of a justice that should not be dependent on the size of one's bank account. She concluded, her gaze sweeping across the jury, the opposing counsel, and finally resting on the judge. The law, in its majesty, is supposed to be a shield for the vulnerable, not a cage. We are here today to ask you to unlock that cage. We are here to ask you to make the promise of justice for all a reality for every citizen of this county, regardless of their wealth or station. We are asking you to do what is right. She sat down, the silence in the courtroom profound. Days later, the jury returned a verdict. They found in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. It was a landmark decision, a stunning victory that would force a complete overhaul of the county's bail system and set a precedent for the entire state. The news made national headlines. That evening, after the press conferences and celebrations, Imani drove to her father's house. She found him on the back porch, watching the sunset. "I heard the news," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I am so proud of you, Imani." "We did it, Dad," she said, sitting beside him. "We did." She thought back to that day in Judge Wallace's courtroom. She remembered the fear, the anger, the feeling of utter powerlessness. She remembered the condescending smirk on the judge's face, a face now lost to history, a disgraced footnote in a story that had become her own. He had tried to silence her, to dismiss her, to make her and her father invisible. Instead, he had forged a champion. He had lit a fire that had not only illuminated the dark corners of his own courtroom, but had grown into a beacon of hope for thousands. The legacy of Courtroom 4B wasn't one of humiliation. It was a legacy of resilience. It was proof that one voice, armed with the truth and the language of the law, could indeed challenge a broken system. It was the story of a father's quiet dignity and a daughter's fierce love, a love that had turned injustice into a lifetime of fighting for it. And for Imani Carter, the fight was far from over. It was just getting started. What began as a humiliating injustice in a small claims court became a catalyst for profound change. Imani Carter, armed with intelligence and courage, not only restored her father's dignity, but also exposed the systemic biases that quietly erode the foundations of justice. Her victory forced the resignation of a corrupt judge and sparked significant reforms within the St. Louis County court system, ensuring greater accountability and fairness for all citizens. Imani's journey from a mocked teenager to a celebrated civil rights attorney serves as a powerful testament to the fact that one person's refusal to be silenced can echo far beyond a single courtroom, creating a legacy of hope and inspiring a new generation to fight for what is right. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content, and share this video. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter.